Well, thank you so much for inviting me to present today. I'm excited to be involved with your center and to get to know some of the researchers that are working there. And thank you all for joining today. I'm happy to be speaking with you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about standards in general and kind of what Nist's disaster and failure studies role in standards and codes is. And then I'm going to walk through some of the places that we've had big impacts in the past and talk about a new standard that I'm highly involved in from a development perspective, but it relates back to something that was done at Nist over 10 years ago. So kind of a nice natural thing for me to jump into as I came to Nist because I was already kind of working on it. So to start us out, just to tell you a little bit about myself, I'm a field person. You could probably gather that from John's description. I've been working in the field since the mid-2000s. Doing my PhD at Texas Tech, I spent a lot of time in the field, both from a damage study perspective, but also from a natural hazard perspective. So I did a large number of damage documentations and assessments, but I also worked on a tornado research project and then a national tornado research project that you may know as Vortex 2. I was part of the Texas Tech Hurricane Research team. We put instruments out in front of hurricanes, tornadoes, used radars to document different things. And then in my career at IBHS, I was highly involved in field activities too, again, both from the hazard perspective and from the damage perspective. Some of you may know my husband there in the blue shirt, that's Ian Jamanco. He's also a field researcher, and he and I have worked in the field together for a very long time, longer than we have been together. So I really enjoy field work, and I really like understanding how the hazards really make an impact on the buildings, and then what we can learn from those events to help us prepare to reduce those damages in the future. So I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about what is a standard and how are they developed, and hopefully you'll find a little bit of humor there. I'll talk about our program's role in developing standards and having activities in codes. And then I'll talk about the new standard that I've been working on with a large number of collaborators, really for about 10 years since we started that process. So starting out with what is a standard and how are they developed? We generally talk about standards in our line of work in terms of consensus-based standards. And there are consensus-based standards for all kinds of things. They rate things from the crayons that my daughter draws with to the speaker that we listen to in my kitchen while I'm cooking. They rate almost anything. Your computer, I guarantee, has a standard rating. Your TV, lots of different electronics, but also lots of different building materials and things that we use to create our homes, our cars, all the different technologies that we use. You can often find these markings if you know what you're looking for. So in my two examples here, there are markings that indicate that these two things are rated by an ASTM standard for the crayons and by a UL standard for the speaker system. So they are marked well on all these different products that you use. And sometimes if they're not on the products themselves, they're on the packaging that the products came in. But these standards are referenced in building codes, not crayon standards, but similar ASTM kinds of standards are referenced in building codes. They follow a consensus-based process, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. It can be a cumbersome process just because of the number of steps that you go through. So it's just important to understand that once we have a new discovery or learn something new from a research perspective, it takes a while to actually implement that into practice by using codes and standards. It can be done, it doesn't happen overnight. So I mentioned the Ansi process, and Ansi stands for the American National Standards Institute. And the standards that we work with in the engineering world are often fall under the Ansi model. And it provides a framework for developing standards in a fair way, making sure that there's not one particular party or sector of business that unfairly leads the direction of the standard development. It's required to be neutral, unbiased. And in order to do that, it has to be a fair and open process. that anybody can participate in or at least observe. There's often opportunities for public comments for even people who are not, on a particular committee, but have a vested interest. Those people have an opportunity often to have their voice heard. There's a balance that's required between the standards committees so that we don't have a sector of the population that's overrepresented. For instance, we wouldn't want to create a standard for a building product that was made up of 90% manufacturers and 10% of users. We want to make sure that there's a balance so that you don't get bias because of the natural activities of the groups. It is a consensus process. So you're basically iterating through a process, often multiple times until you come to a resolution that everybody generally agrees with, or you reach a large majority. So this is kind of a conceptual diagram of how research in disaster and failure studies can lead to building codes. So if you imagine that an event actually kind of kicks things off, that could be a hurricane, a tornado, an earthquake, a building collapse like we're dealing with from this summer's collapse of Champlain Towers in Miami, Florida. Some kind of triggering event kicks us researchers into gear. And that research community can be very large, very broad, but it triggers some kind of activity where people go try to understand what happened and how can we prevent it from happening. Once that kind of process takes place, a lot of times many collaborators will get together to draft a new standard or perhaps to revise an existing standard. And that goes through a balloting process. And that balloting process can be short, long, it depends on how quick it is to reach consensus. So you'll see I've got my green circle there. That can happen multiple times. Once a consensus is reached within the committee, it has an opportunity for public comment, but the standard could then go into the building code process. And you'd have a similar kind of cycle where a lot of people may work together on a proposal, or maybe just a few, and that proposal gets drafted and then it gets balloted. Once it passes the balloting, we go into, again, public comment, publication, and then it actually goes into adoption by state and local governments, depending on where you live, or it could be modified by those same bodies. But this can be a very lengthy process, as you'll see. And just to give you a hint, not that you need to read anything in detail on here, but this is I call it my spreadsheet of fun. This is how I keep track of the standard I'm going to talk to you about. There's over 30 different parts. And you can see that in some instances, I'm up at reballot number 4. So it is like painful for me to keep track of all this. And I really just couldn't. So I had to start color coding things and marking where exactly they were in the process. It can be a very laborious process. So now I'll talk a little bit about some of our previous studies and things that we have ongoing to understand disaster and failure studies, but specifically to talk about how they have impacted codes over the years since the program was really stood up. So to give an overview, the Disaster and Failure Studies program at Nist basically is the coordinating mechanism to establish teams to conduct preliminary reconnaissance missions or investigations under our National Construction Safety Team Authority, which I'll talk about in just a few minutes. But it basically gives us the chance as scientists and engineers to go out after building failures. That could be caused by a natural event. It could be caused by another event like a terrorist activity in the case of the World Trade Center collapse. But our goal is not to find fault, but we do want to understand what happened, what caused the failure, what factors or individual factor contributed to the failure, and do a technical investigation specifically with the goal of using the findings, the cause findings, to develop changes to codes and standards, again, with the goal to try to reduce these damages from happening in the future. So here are some of the different authorities that we have that we can use to conduct these studies. The first one is the main one that I'm going to talk about, and that one gives us a broad authority to do investigations across a multitude of hazards. But we do also have some specific ones that relate to earthquake in the case of NEHRP, and wind in the case of NWERP, and then our fire activities would often happen under the Nist Organic Act. But specifically, the National Construction Safety Team Act is the one I'm going to focus on and really highlight some of the things that we have going on in our 2 open investigations. So this is for any kind of building failure, no matter what caused the failure. And our goal, again, is to come up with an understanding of what happened in the event and work with other parties or through the codes and standards process to prevent it. It gives us the goal to basically find the technical reason for the damage, not a fault finding investigation. A couple of things that are unique to this particular act: it does give us the ability to subpoena for records or information. I understand that we haven't used it yet, but we do have that ability if we need it. It does give us investigator credentials, which are managed through the Department of Commerce. So that gives us quick access to places that are generally restricted after a disaster, helps make us recognizable to law enforcement, whether it's local, state, or federal. We do have a federal advisory committee. We just had a meeting with that committee back in November, but they really help us think of ways to move forward with our projects, different angles that we might want to look at. They can tip us off to data sets that they might know of. These are experts in their field, so they really bring a lot of expertise to help us as we move through our investigations. And as part of the National Construction Safety Team Act, we do need to follow through on our recommendations and reports to Congress. So when we do these investigations, we come up with a list of recommendations, but we don't just stop our work there. We also have to move towards implementing these recommendations and continue to follow up on them until they are fully implemented. So you'll see a little bit of that in a few minutes. We've got a long history of disaster studies at Nist. So you can see some of the different events that our scientists and researchers have worked on over the years, even starting back, 40, 50 years ago, we had investigations going on. The ones that you see highlighted in red are our National Construction Safety Team investigations. This authority was granted to us in 2002 in the wake of the World Trade Center collapse. So everything that was done before that was not under this particular authority. But again, from an understanding of the science and measurements and things that we could learn and make an impact on, we still had the ability to go out and do investigations even prior to gaining that authority. And then you'll also see that we have 2 studies that are still ongoing that are not under the National Construction Safety Team. So those are highlighted in yellow. One of them is in association with the Center of Excellence at Colorado State, and that's the Lumberton longitudinal study as part of originally Hurricane Matthew, but then Hurricane Florence and other events as well. We've also got the Camp Fire from California in 2018 as well. That's ongoing. So we've got 3 investigations that we have wrapped up under the NCST authority. And the first one is the World Trade Center. Again, that was the one that really triggered Congress to pass the act and give a federal authority to an agency to actually do these kinds of investigations. Prior to that, there really wasn't an obvious choice. On the criminal side, there are obvious choices for investigating things like the World Trade Center collapse. But from a technical standpoint, understanding the engineering and then trying to do better and reduce these kind of damages in the future, there wasn't an obvious organization or agency that was charged with that. With the World Trade Center collapse, that was delegated to Nist in 2002. So our researchers worked for many years to go through the evidence, get an understanding of what happened, and finally to issue their final reports. The Station Nightclub fire happened in Rhode Island in 2003, and this was an event where a large number of people died when a fire happened and they couldn't evacuate the area. There was almost 100 people that died in that particular event. So it was one that was really important to understand as we think about how to retrofit buildings or how to design these kinds of large gathering places We have to make sure that the proper materials are used and that there are ways for people to escape so that they don't get caught in an area while a fire is going on and not be able to get away. The Joplin tornado is our most recently finished NCST investigation. This occurred in 2011 and was the most deadly tornado in the state of Missouri. And there were a very large number of buildings that were damaged by this. There were communications challenges with people not really understanding how severe of an event this was. So there was a lot of things we could do in terms of codes and standards for the Joplin tornado as well. We have two current investigations that are open right now under the NCST. The first one is Hurricane Maria's effects on Puerto Rico from 2017. We've got 4 specific projects under the NCST authority that are listed here. One to understand the hazard itself, so the hurricane conditions. One to understand performance of critical buildings like hospitals, schools, and shelters. One to look at the public response to emergency communications and whether or not they were able to receive those communications. And one to understand where deaths occurred as it related to building failures, evacuation failures, loss of infrastructure, things like that. There are also 3 other projects that are covered under our NWERP authority. So if you want to learn more about those, you can definitely find that on our website. The other investigation that we have open right now is the Champlain Tower South collapse from Miami, Florida area over this summer. This event happened in my first 2 weeks on the job, so it was a little hectic to get stood up, but our team has really come a very long way since the investigation was launched in late June of this year. There are 6 projects associated with this. One is looking at the building code history, so understanding what codes were in place, how the building was actually built compared to how it was designed or how it should have been built in regard to the code. There's an evidence preservation project. So that is taking all of the structural evidence pieces that we found, as well as any documents, videos, and making sure we have procedures to handle those things and to log and record information so that it feeds into the other projects. We've got a remote sensing and data visualization project, which takes in a large number of data sets and helps come up with a 3D model or representation of the damage and of the original conditions. We've got a material science project, which evaluates the characteristics of the rebar, the concrete, the different materials that were used in the building itself. We have a geotechnical and foundation engineering project, which looks at the subsurface conditions to understand how they may have played a role in the building's failure or not. And then finally, we have a structural engineering project, which takes many of the pieces from the previous projects and is seeking to build a failure collapse model to help understand how a factor or combination of factors led to the collapse. So switching gears a little bit, when we conduct these kinds of studies, one of the things that we put out, again, is these recommendations, and a lot of them are directed at changes to codes and standards. So this example is from our most recently completed investigation, which is the Joplin Tornado investigation. And I put this one up because it is the most recent one that we have, but there's been a lot of work going on in these areas for quite a while. The Joplin Tornado happened over 10 years ago, and we're still actively working on several things with regard to these recommendations, one of which is the standard I'm going to talk about in a little bit. This is improving the EF scale and coming up with a better way to estimate tornado wind speeds and getting it adopted by the National Weather Service. That is the standard that I've been working on for a while with a large number of collaborators across many different disciplines. So I'll talk in more detail about that. So there's a long tail to implement these NCST recommendations. Again, Joplin Tornado 10 years ago, and we're still actively working on things for that one. So starting off, though, with a couple of other things that have been going on recently, the World Trade Center collapse happened just over 20 years ago. And yes, in 2021, we are still working on particular recommendations that came out of that. The process is slow, but we have a responsibility to be diligent in making sure that the recommendations move forward to prevent these kinds of tragedies. So just this year, we had a draft standard that was completed and preparing for public comment through ASCE. That came out of recommendation number 1 in the World Trade Center. For recommendation number 2, we had 2 different things going on this year. We had a revision of a wind tunnel testing standard that was being published, and we had a revision of ASCE 7 wind profiles that are due to be published in 2022 when that revision of ASCE 7 comes out. On the Joplin Tornado side of things, 10 years in, we had something going on with recommendation number 3. So we're going to have tornado hazard maps when ASCE 7 gets published in 2022. We've got the development of a smart damage indicator that could fall under the EF scale being developed and proposed for the new standard that I'm going to talk a little bit more about. And we've got tornado load designs and load provisions that are being included in ASCE 7. And we've got an expanded scope with regard to shelters that was published in 2020 for tornado shelters in ICC 500. So even despite the fact that these events happened 20 and 10 years ago, respectively, there is still work to be done to move this forward. And as you kind of look at all of the different work that Nist has done in this space in the past, here's some highlights. Again, the red is highlighting NCST activities, but you can see we've got improvements to OSHA requirements. We've got improvements to the Hotel Motel Sprinkler Act. We've got improvements to HUD's manufactured home construction. We've got guidelines for the American Institute of Steel Construction. We've got the enhanced Fujita scale. With the World Trade Center alone, there were over 40 ICC code changes. So you can see that there's really an extensive list of things that can happen as a result of these disaster and failure studies. And yes, they're really interesting. And yes, we're all fascinated by what happens in these. But there is real activity on the other side too. It's not just about going out and seeing what happened, but really seeing it through to making change. That's really at the core of what we try to do in the Disaster and Failure Studies program. So now I'll talk a little bit specifically about the new standard that came out of one of the recommendations from the Joplin tornado. So just to give a little history on this, I got involved with this in 2010. There was a stakeholders workshop that was pulled together by Jim Ledoux at NOAA's Warning Decision Training branch at that time. Now it's Warning Decision Training Division. And he just got together, some of the researchers and people that he knew that had a vested interest in understanding tornado wind speeds, measuring tornado wind speeds. And we just kind of had a relatively casual conversation for a few years, meeting once or twice a year. But we really saw that as more and more tornado events happened, that we needed to do better in this space. And the EF scale, while it's an improvement over the Fujita scale, doesn't have a mechanism to actually change it. It was published, and then it's kind of like, okay, well, who's responsible for updating it the next time? And there really wasn't a clear path. So a large group of us kind of conglomerated together and found a path through ASCE and the Structural Engineering Institute to work on this. And as part of that process, we do have engineers involved, but we also have a lot of meteorologists, as well as a few other disciplines as well. And so we brought in the American Meteorological Society as kind of the third major organization that's involved in this. So a little bit of kind of why we're embarking on this. Tornado wind speeds are inherently difficult to measure. They often occur in open areas where there's nothing out there. There's no buildings, there's no measurements, there's no roads. But even if they occur in places where that's not the case, how many people have a wind instrument right as a tornado tears through a neighborhood? It's very rare. They are very difficult to measure. The Fujita scale was developed by Dr. Theodore Ted Fujita in 1971, and it was a qualitative scale that basically allowed for estimating tornado wind speeds in categories of 0 up to 5. And the wind speeds ranged from 40 to 318 miles an hour. And they were basically based on the observable damage. So very light damage to maybe just a few shingles, that would be in the EF0 area. Once you got up to total disruption of a building where it was knocked down to the slab or foundation. That was what he judged to be an F5 tornado. And he did some connecting of the Mach scale and the Beaufort scale to come up with the wind speeds associated with these different damages. But again, it was, no exact measurements associated with it. So the enhanced Fujita scale was introduced in 2006 by Texas Tech, and it was actually funded out of a Nist study that showed that using the F scale really didn't give us a good sense of the wind speeds that were causing certain kinds of damage. It was developed in 2006 and kept the same basic framework of minor to major damage ranging from 0 to 5, but instead of being F0 and F5, it's now EF0 and EF5 for enhanced Fujita scale. The wind speeds range from 65 to 200 miles an hour. There are now 28 damage indicators, and in the previous F scale, it was mostly focused on houses and residential buildings. But the new revision brought about other things that could be damaged. There are damage indicators for manufactured homes, for barns, for metal buildings, for schools, for lots of different common buildings that a tornado could potentially impact. And it was adopted by the National Weather Service in 2007. And it is shown here on the screen. So the wind speeds that are associated with the categories 0 through 5 are different than they were in the F scale. There's a comparison in the EF document itself. If you download it from Texas Tech University, there are some differences. Probably most notably is that EF5 caps off at 200 miles an hour and just says anything over 200 miles an hour is going to be EF5, versus in the Fujita scale, the wind speed for F5 went up over 300 miles an hour. And there was just a thought that wasn't a very good representation, that we don't really know where you would draw some of those lines. And there's no reason to believe that speeds have to be that high to cause that destructive of damage. So the EF scale was a little different in terms of how it was formulated, because it was a group of several engineers and meteorologists who basically reached a consensus. They used an expert elicitation process and worked through a series of pictures for these different damage indicators until they came to a general consensus on what range of speeds might cause those damages. So a little bit more, rigorous, you would say, than the Fujita scale. It did include multiple experts, but still we're using some human-based judgment to come up with the numbers and the different damage states that are associated with the speeds. There are currently 28 damage indicators in the EF scale. I won't go through all of them. I mentioned some of them, but lots of things that could be found in reasonably sized towns are included here. Motels, gas station canopies, things like that. And there are 2 DIs associated with trees. But after this started being used, there were some challenges that came up relatively quickly. There was concerns about the relationship between the degree of damage to some of these damage indicators and the wind speeds associated with them. Again, they were based purely on expert opinion. There was no data or measurements behind them. So you can see how that would be the case. The wind speeds represent a lower bound for damage. So if you had something that was going to be damaged at, call it 100 miles an hour, when you see that damage state, there's still the question, was the wind 100 miles an hour when it happened? Was it 105? Was it 200 miles an hour? Once the thing is damaged at the lower wind speed, there's no way to assess what the highest wind speed could have been. And that came out of the Nist Joplin report. There were only 5 DIs that could result in an EF5 tornado. So out of the entire list of 28, only 5 of them had wind speeds that were high enough to get to an EF5 rating. So we did need some, call it tougher DIs that could stand a little bit higher wind speeds. There was no guidance on rating a single large building like is shown here on the screen. This is a very large building that was damaged in the Joplin tornado. And you can see there are parts of the building that look virtually untouched versus the middle part, which is obviously significantly damaged. Should this all be treated as one damage indicator, or really should it be broken into a couple of pieces? That's one of the questions that's open. There was limited guidance for some DIs, meaning there wasn't picture examples of what some of the different damage dates were. There was a need for new DIs, especially in rural areas. If you had a tornado that occurred out in rural farmland areas, there's not a lot of things to damage out there. And that was identified as an issue because everybody would rate a tornado as E of 0 there. And that may not be right. There may be wind speeds much, much faster than that. And again, there's no formal mechanism to update the standard. Texas Tech published it, but there wasn't a committee. It wasn't published in a standards body. So it was just there. And there was a lot of questions about what do we do now? So specific to the Nist Joplin Tornado recommendation number 4, that's associated with improving EF scale and getting it implemented. One of the things that was recommended was creating new damage indicators to distinguish between the most intense tornado events. I can tell you at this point, we don't have any new great ones that are being introduced right now. Hopefully we'll have some in the future, but right now we don't have any that are going to increase our quantity that can reach an EF5 designation. They also recommended methodologies be used in the development of new DIs. They should be scientific in nature and quantifiable. So I've got a couple of examples of where we're going with that. One of the new damage indicators that's being proposed is passenger vehicles. So, this is not buses or box trucks or anything like that, but it's the day-to-day cars that we all drive, to go to work, to go to school, to go to the grocery store. It's our passenger vehicles. And this is being proposed based on wind tunnel work. So we do actually have some data that are being pulled out for this particular DI that gives us some confidence in terms of what speed it takes to roll a vehicle or slide a vehicle and slide different distances. So that's a really encouraging advancement. It is also one that could help us with the rural issue. Even if you're out in farmlands, there's often vehicles around there, maybe not as dense as in an urban area, but it is still something that could help fill in some of those gaps. We are revising the tree DIs based on modeling studies. Right now, the EF scale treats trees as hardwood and softwood trees, but our forest biologists and ecologists, they don't really think that that's the appropriate way to do it. They think that using characteristics like the shape and whether it's leaved or not and what its root structure look like, that those are better representations. And so our tree DIs in the future are going to be based on a single tree or groupings of trees because they will behave different. And they are based on modeling studies, some of which have been done by winching trees over and finding out how much force it takes to pull them over. So we're encouraged to see that data set coming together to help with this. I also would love to blow wind at trees and see what we can figure out, but that's for another day. A couple other things to note. The Nist report recommended that there be some kind of committee that was comprised of people from different groups and organizations and different interests to be able to change the EF scale and implement the changes. And that's really where our group kind of came into being. Again, we had our stakeholders group that was formed in 2010, and that grew into the formal ASCE SEI committee in 2014. And that really gave us a framework to move this into a standard that's more typical of what we think in the engineering discipline and will allow it to have a long life beyond just our group's individual interest. And the last recommendation out of the Nist report was that the EF scale should be adopted by the National Weather Service. We feel pretty confident that that will happen once it's published. Not checking it off right now because we don't have it published, so they can't adopt it yet. But we have a large number of Weather Service employees that are involved in the committee, many of whom are in leadership roles. That's part of why we got the AMS involved as well, so that there would be continuity with the meteorological community. So that's one that we will work on once we have the standard published. But while all of this is going on, there's other things that are happening with other research groups as well. There have been a large number of alternate methods published to estimate tornado wind speeds. Some of them are mentioned here on the screen. There have been publications of teams that operate mobile Doppler radars, where they're actually sampling the tornado structure from a distance using a radar technology. There have been studies on tree fall pattern analysis. There have been studies, basically an engineering forensics analysis of engineered structures. And these can provide wind speeds in a different way than we're used to. Right now, everything is based on a human, or in some cases, people are working on automation, but it's a judgment of wind speed based on the damage that's visibly seen. These types of studies, or these alternate methods, really start to get into a little bit more of a data-driven solution. But having these alternate methods out there while the EF scale is still being used can lead to inconsistencies in wind speed ratings. Probably one of the most famous examples of this was the El Reno, Oklahoma tornado in 2013. This happened in a relatively rural area just outside of Oklahoma City, where there wasn't a lot of things for the tornado to hit. So based on the damage assessment, it was rated as an EF3 tornado, but it's in the Oklahoma City area, which means there's lots of tornado research groups out there, and many of them were operating Doppler radar that day, and they measured wind speeds much in excess of EF3. But the official National Weather Service directive is thou shalt use the EF scale. So there's a pretty big discrepancy between the meteorological community and what this rating was. In a purist sense, by definition, it's an EF3, but that's because, again, there weren't things to hit that could be damaged at a higher level. So the radar people, they have direct measurements, which is really great, but we need to be able to reconcile this. So our new method, or our new standard, would give us the opportunity to actually bring all these different methods together and try to remove some of this inconsistency. So again, we had a difference in damage with this method compared to the EF scale, or a difference in wind speed rating with this method compared to the EF scale. And all of these methods are being addressed within the new ASCE standard. So this new standard, at least as it relates to the EF scale, is going to redefine the existing damage indicators based on new research. We are introducing several new DI. So I already mentioned the passenger vehicles, but we're also introducing churches or religious buildings, farm silos and grain bins. We're introducing center pivot irrigation systems. Many of them are things that would help us in the rural areas, but churches is another one. Religious buildings is one that might get us a little bit more in the smaller communities as well. We're also looking at potentially things like wind turbines, but that's a little bit further in the development process. We are also looking at making major changes to several of the existing damage indicators. This includes mobile homes. Instead of having different categories for single and double wide manufactured homes, we're collapsing those into one damage indicator. We're distinguishing between stick-built or wood frame construction for residential buildings and those that are built with a concrete structural system. And we're combining schools in a little bit different way. In the current EF scale, they're classified by elementary school versus junior and senior high school. In the revisions that are underway right now, they would be classified by size. So single story versus multi-story is the main distinguishing characteristic. And we're also introducing a couple of new concepts in what's being proposed. The first one is the wind resistance levels. So this gives us a chance to use how strong the object is or how strong the building is, and let that guide us in terms of understanding what wind speed likely caused certain levels of damage. We're standardizing degrees of damage and the wind speeds associated with them. In the current EF scale, for one DI, you might have shingle damage starting at 50 miles an hour. And then in another DI, you might have it starting at 60 miles an hour, but it's the same building product. So places where things should be consistent, we're making them consistent. It standardizes an evaluation procedure, so actually gives directions in terms of how to use the scale. It includes additional guidance or photographs as examples, And there's a very long and extensive commentary that explains how to use it, as well as where the data came from that backs up the things that are moving forward in the standard. What is not changing is the EF scale itself, which means that if it's an EF1 tornado, it's still estimating wind speeds between 86 and 110 miles an hour. We don't see a need to make a change there. These are just categories, but the real charge of the standard is to estimate wind speeds. The EF scale is just a byproduct of that. So I mentioned the other methods that are being included in the new standard includes a mobile radar method. It includes a forensic engineering method, includes a tree fall method. There's a remote sensing method. There's an in situ measurement method. So these are all things that will ultimately produce a wind speed estimate, which is really what the objective and scope of the new standard is. So to wrap it all up, there's a lot that we can learn and really can take advancements forward by doing studies post-disaster and really getting an understanding of technical causes of damage. And these are really the things that help us drive forward to changing codes and standards as they relate to the buildings that we live and work in. The process is extremely lengthy. I've been chairing the EF Scale Committee since the beginning for this particular standard that I described, and we have a long way to go. I'm in ballot for revision for a few of the DIs. Out of what I think will be over 1,000 pages of standards, I have one sentence that is cleared entirely through the process, and it is the purpose. The purpose is the only thing that's 100% approved by the committee at this point. So it is a long haul, but overall, the new standard should improve our understanding of tornado risk and tornado climatology. Right now, everything is based on the EF scale, and if the EF scale values are incorrect, we're not accurately assessing the tornado risk in our country and really throughout the world.